So you're listening to Two Teachers Talking, and I'm here with Susan Diaz. My name's Cassandra Allen, and we're talking about PLCs and writing. So, Susan, talk to me about why this topic. Like, why do we care about how teachers talk about writing in their PLC?
Well, I think it's important because it's something that teachers struggle with. So typically when we do any kind of survey of what the teachers want to know more about or what they think the students are struggling on, it's always writing. And traditionally it's what we have scored the lowest on state assessments, but it's not just us, it's the whole state of Texas. So I know that writing is important to the teachers, so that's kind of why I've been interested in this topic.
Yeah, so writing is a struggle.
Yes.
Writing all over the state is a struggle, and I think just academic writing in general is what you're seeing at the college level is like really a struggle bus for students as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is the data like important for you in your job?
Yes. So I am the assistant director of high school English, so I oversee the curriculum, instruction, and assessment for 7 large high schools in Northeast ISD. Yes, so writing is very important to what I do for a living.
And what about the PLC process? Like, why is that something that's like part of the district, or is that just at the school you were taking data at, or what's the story with PLCs?
So the story with PLCs is we tried to get them up and running a couple of years ago. So it's still new for us in the district, and we know that there is a lot of research that supports the efficacy of PLCs because it's teachers working collectively instead of in isolation. And so there's a lot of data to support that it's better for instruction, but it's also better for their mental well-being instead of feeling alone, being able to work together in a team.
Yeah. So talk to me then a little bit about this particular school or the setting for this, where you took your research, and then tell me a little bit about participants.
Okay. So the school we're going to refer to as Lincoln High School. That's not the actual name, but okay. I'm using a pseudonym for it. And the reason I chose this school was because they were doing a training on writing on a day that was available to me. So basically it was kind of out of convenience in some ways, but they were talking about writing, and it was going to be a full day professional development. And so I just thought it would be a good day to listen in and gather some data.
Cool. And what about the participants?
So the participants were one of my specialists. So she was leading the professional development and kind of guiding the learning for the day. Her name's Jennifer. Also in attendance was the department chair, Mandy. We refer to our department chairs as deans in Northeast. So she is part of this PLC, and they're actually English 1 teachers. And also there were 5 just teachers present. One of them's name is Rudy, Marla, Donna, Angelita, and Leslie. So there were
5 females. Interesting.
Yeah, 5 females.
Are they all white, or are they sort of like a mixed group, or what's?
They're a mixed group.
Okay.
Marla and Rudy and Angelita are Hispanic, and Donna, Leslie, and Mandy are white.
Okay. And then just if you were to guess like how old or how long each of them have been teaching, like what do you think the average like teacher years among them is?
I'd say over 10. They're all veteran teachers.
Okay. And are they used to working in a PLC, and are they used to you and your specialist Jennifer?
Yes. So that is one of the reasons why we did pick that school is they're very comfortable around us. So I felt that I'd get more candid responses as opposed to a school that I don't go to very often. So I have a good relationship with them, and I thought that they'd be honest and wouldn't be freaked out that I was recording them.
Yeah, good. That's important. So then what kind of data did you take? Like, what did you actually, what were you recording?
Okay. So after doing some research, I found, I can't remember the name of the brand, but it's like a little MP3 recorder, a digital recorder. And I just kind of set it down and told them that I was going to record them and then walked away from it. And for the most part, they seemed to ignore it, except for there were a couple of times that somebody told a joke to it, like right to the microphone. But so I did that. I recorded them. And I also took field notes while the PD was going on. And then I transcripted the recordings, and then I coded it looking for themes.
Okay. So you were just kind of doing some open coding, looking for things that stood out to you? Mm-hmm. So what stood out to you then?
So one of the things that the word struggle was in the transcripts a lot, but in a good way. So a lot of the teachers mentioned wanting to support their struggling students, but without being formulaic or without taking away their voice. So the teachers themselves mentioned struggling to find a balance between how do you scaffold for the kids without encroaching on their creativity or their voice.
And so this was like, we were mostly talking about like on-level English 1 classrooms.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so actually they did mention kind of stifling their GT kids or their pre-AP kids too as well. But you're right, most of the concern was focused on the kind of general education students.
Do you think that that is like a real struggle, or do you think that's an excuse?
That's a good question. I think it might be a struggle that emerged during the professional development. I think if we hadn't had been there doing this professional development with them in the PLC, I think that maybe it's something that they wouldn't have noticed. But part of the reason they noticed it was because we were reading kids' essays, samples of essays from the state where the kids had scored really high, and they noticed that a lot of those kids were using their own experiences or using kind of unique ways to organize their writing and not using the same kind of formulaic 4 or 5 paragraph essay. So when after they kind of saw that the state was allowing the kids to do different things, then I think that they realized that maybe they were overly scaffolding or maybe teaching their kids formulas.
So there's 2 things that come to my mind when you're saying this. One is that we hadn't talked about the protocol that you and your specialist were using. So what were you actually doing with them?
Okay, good question. So what we do every year is when the kids take a benchmark essay, they take a benchmark exam, there's an essay portion on it, and then we put together a training for the teachers. Usually we bring everyone together, but we had done it so many years and people were kind of getting burnt out. So instead, what we did was we collected sample essays from across the district, and then we put the essays together in packets where we had pre-scored them. So the idea was to take them to the PLCs, and maybe they could use the essays to kind of calibrate to make sure that they were scoring the same. So that's what we were doing. So we pulled kids' essays, we had scored them, we had put them in packets, and the idea was the teachers could use the essays any way they wanted in their PLCs to either calibrate or use them with their own students in class to be like, hey, here's some good essays, let's look at what these kids did, or here's some common mistakes that I see you all making, how can we fix these things? So there are lots of different ways that they could have used the essay sets that we put together, but that was the training of the day. So basically they came in the morning and we walked them through some of the state release samples so they could see examples of 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. So 1 would be the lowest score, 4 would be the highest, and those were scored by the state. So once they kind of felt like, okay, we understand how the state is scoring, then we showed them the sets that we had put together, so that way they felt confident, like the way that we scored them was accurate, and they were okay with that. And then after they felt like they understood the score points, then they began to score not their own papers, but they switched with partners. So they weren't scoring their own kids, they were scoring one of their colleagues' kids.
So that protocol served 2 points. They had buy-in to the process, right? And then also they were calibrating so they could figure out how to score and how the state was scoring.
Mm-hmm.
And then how to potentially like guide their kids. When did the conversation about creativity come in? When they were doing that?
So, yes, after we had looked at some of the state essays, and then we had looked through the sample essays that we had put together, that's when they had the conversation about the creativity and the different ways that kids could approach the essay, and it didn't have to be one certain way. So it was kind of after they had gone through 2 sets of essays, but not their own kids yet at that point.
Okay. And so that is definitely one of the themes. And then what other themes emerged?
So another theme that emerged that was positive, and it's kind of connected to the other theme, was that they needed to value the lived experiences of their students, because that they had the epiphany that the kids' essays were stronger when they wrote about things that they knew, and often the things that they know are personal in nature. So there was a lot of conversations about like, oh, they don't have to use a historical example. They can use their mother as an example. So, kind of things were clicking in their heads, and then they all kept saying again, we need to value the kids' experiences and let them know that those things are important for them to write about, because actually the essays were better when the kids were writing about something that they seemed kind of excited about.
Or that they knew, which just makes sense. That's just human nature. I would rather write to you about things I know than to write about stuff I don't know.
Right. Yeah, but I think that they thought that the state kind of frowned upon that. But after seeing so many essays of kids doing that where the state was scoring them highly, then they were like, oh, okay, we finally believe you. Even though we've been saying that to them for 3.5 years, for some reason, it seemed to sink in this time.
Yeah, because at some point, though, there was a pendulum shift from really wanting kids not just to write personal narratives, right? So right. Do you think that that's some of where they get that paranoia from, is like we don't need to be having kids write personal narratives anymore?
Right. I think that that's where it came from, because originally when the STAR test came out, they did have to write 2 essays at the freshman level, and one was it was a story, but they could tell a personal narrative, and then the other one was exposition. So in the beginning, I do think that they were clearly trying to draw a line between the two, because they saw that the kids were so used to writing personal narratives that they would dip into it when they were writing exposition. But we're so far away from that I don't think that that's an issue, and I think finally they're feeling like, okay, I get it. These kids can write about their personal experiences, and that's evidence in an expository essay.
Yeah, cool. So, anything else that emerged?
Yes. So another thing that they kept talking about was connections, like helping the kids make connections to the prompt, because in some ways they think that the kids don't know what to write about, because when they read the prompt it seems very foreign to them. So they did talk about how to look at whatever the state gives them and how they can connect their personal experiences to whatever that topic is. So they talked about explicitly helping the kids to connect to that prompt.
Can you give an example of a prompt, since I'm not a big English person and since I'm a social studies background? Like, what would be a typical kind of prompt?
Okay, so one year they asked whether it was better to live in a big city or a small town. One time they asked about is education important to success? So both of those topics lend to personal experiences because you either live in a small town or a big city, so you could write about your experiences in one of those things. You know, like maybe I don't know what it's like to live in a big city, but I live in a small town. So I'm going to say it's better to live in a small town, and I'm going to, you know, tell you why, because, you know, Mr. Martinez at the corner store gives me free popsicles and everybody knows each other and blah, blah, blah. And also the thing about education, either they know, either, you know, their families are not educated and they see the struggles of that, or they are educated and they see that that's wonderful, or maybe they see educated people and they think it's awful.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, cool. So making connections.
Yeah, and then the last thing I think that emerged were them, when they started looking at their own kids' writing, there seemed to be a joy that came from them. They, after, you know, switching their mindset from formulas and not being able to use personal experiences and not trying to tell them how to organize their writing, that they saw that the kids, like if they could look at it with a different set of eyes, then suddenly what these kids were writing was kind of inspiring. So, you know, a lot of times they were like, oh my gosh, I love this kid. And they're their own students. But it was, I think it really came from just them shifting their mindset from formula to having a more open mind and just wanting to know what the kids thought. And that is in some ways what the state is looking for. They want to know what the kid thinks, not what the teachers think. And when you teach them a formula, you're hearing more of a teacher voice and not a student voice. So when they were able to look at their own kids in that kind of light, they seemed pretty excited about it.
Yeah. So when you were doing this data collection and research on this day, were you participating or were you more of an observer?
I was kind of both.
Okay.
So there were moments where, you know, they'd ask me a question, and so I would chime in, and then I tried also to kind of sit back and just listen. So I was only a participant when they pulled me in. Mm-hmm. Other than that, I tried to sit back and observe because I was worried about trying to take field notes for the first time and then participating. But sometimes it's hard not to get involved in their conversations. So for me, really kind of staying out of it was more a matter of trying to take field notes for the first time.
Yeah, so that lends itself towards some of the challenges. So what was... I know there's some personal things about starting the process of just doing research in this way that can be difficult. But so what were some of the challenges you felt like you ran into while you were doing this?
Well, I mean, some of them were stupid things like, again, just trying to take field notes for the first time and wondering what in the world am I supposed to be writing in these things? Like I'm recording it. Like, why am I typing at the same time? It wasn't until later on that I came home and listened to the recordings that I realized, oh, there are things you can't hear, you see. And mm-hmm. maybe those are the things that you need to be taking notes on mm-hmm. more, is, you know, interactions between people that the audio recording wouldn't have picked up. So it's just kind of little lessons learned like that. And then also when... At first, I put the microphone in kind of the center of where they were, and then Jen had them get up and do some activity where they were at stations, and then I'm like, oh crap, okay, so they're moving away from the microphone, and now there's like 3 stations around the room. What do I do? So then I just went and set it at the station that I thought would be kind of the more interesting conversations would emerge from being at that station. And then also what I did notice is sometimes I couldn't distinguish their voices. When I listened back, I couldn't tell who was who. So some of the ladies sound kind of similar. And then I was like, is that Donna? Is that Leslie? Mm-hmm. You know, so the ones that I know really well, I know their voices. But some of them that I don't know as well, it was hard to kind of remember who it was that was saying it. And then... So then I also used a transcription tool, some kind of free one, and it's done by a computer, and a lot of the transcripts needed to be edited. So that was...
And by edited, you just mean like it from the machine, it didn't transcribe it correctly.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Especially when there was a lot of crosstalk. There were a lot of brackets that said inaudible when people were talking at the same time. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And then the other thing that I'm always concerned about is that these are my teachers, and I'm afraid always to try and like to paint them in a bad light. But fortunately, you know, they were beautiful human beings at this moment and didn't say anything horrible. But I do wonder in the future, you know, how do you navigate when these are my people and
data collection. Yeah, I think this is really like hard to like, yeah. I mean, I think this is the researcher's dilemma, right? Is it better to be an insider or an outsider?
Right.
And so when you're an insider, are they telling you all the things that you want to hear and doing all the things that, you know, is going to be perfectly matched with your study, versus if you weren't there, would they be saying stuff that...
Wow, these kids are awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's that, and it's also not wanting to hurt anybody's feelings. Like, you know, if this ever... I mean, this was practice, but if, you know, when it gets time to real research and this is something that everybody can access, I do worry about how it'll affect my teachers.
Oh, that's perceived. Yeah. But I think one way that you would, if you were doing this in long term, right, you would keep going back to that same group of teachers and continue to collect data, so you can cross-reference with that way. But I think for this, it's reassuring when you're doing in researcher phase and you're watching a bunch of people and then you realize like you're reaffirmed in what's going on in schools. When sometimes we get bogged down in our jobs with some of the negativity in schools.
Right, yeah. And I don't want to get bogged down in negativity. I want to find, you know, positive things to celebrate.
What would you do differently if you were going to go back right now and do it all over again? What would you change? I've stumped her, everyone.
Yeah, good question.
Two teachers talking. It's not very fun when only one teacher's talking.
I don't know. I mean, I think I'd do everything differently because now I've experienced it. Like before, I had no idea what I was doing. So I think I might have some better questions in mind because I think that made it harder to even find any kind of themes. Well, it was good because they did repeat the same words, you know, so in some ways maybe it was good to not have questions. But I think if I would have had some more kind of specific questions, then it would have helped me focus. It might have been easier.
You're talking about your research questions?
Yeah, the research question, because they were really vague. It was just like, hey, what do they talk about? You know, that was kind of my question because I had no idea, you know, what they were going to say or do or even what I was looking for. Just wanting to, you know, basically it was to find out if they were going to say negative or positive things, and they were super positive. But I think it would probably help to have more specific questions, but I think that'll come naturally whenever it's not just practice and it's something that I'm going to do for real.
Yeah.
So.
And field notes are challenging. When you were saying that, I was thinking back to when I was collecting data for my dissertation, and it was really hard to do classroom observations because I didn't always know like what to write down.
Right.
So sometimes I would like sketch the classroom, and then that I did that with one of my participants, I had to do with all of them, and so field notes are super challenging because it's not always clear from the get-go like what is going to stand out.
Right.
Even if you have really great questions, like so I found that challenging as well. But when you said that, I thought like, well, I don't think there's like a field note perfection.
No.
I know that also people write a lot of questions in their field notes.
Okay.
Like just things that come up, and then when they're transcribing, they look at those. But I digress. So, any last words for the listeners?
Nope.
Okay, this is Two Teachers Talking. We've been talking with Susan Diaz about writing at Lincoln High School in the PLC process.
Thank you, Cassie.